Welcome to Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your guide through the chaos and the order, the glory and the obscurity, and the wonder and banality of this pivotal series of centuries. The first part of this episode is a meditation of sorts on the very title of this show. It's a recentering of the show's true focus and the self-correction after 4 years of study. The second part of the episode is a look at where we've been so far in our medieval story, a reflection of sorts. A reminder, as over the course of 144 episodes, we've seen and learned quite a bit. The third part of this episode will give us a firm vision for what lies ahead in the next leg of our medieval journey. And finally, I'll lay out an improved and clearer vision for the show that will also have a little reveal at the end that I've been mulling over for well over a year now. Whether you are a new listener or a familiar one, I hope you stick around to the end so we can embark upon this next turn of the wheel together. I'm excited about this episode, and I'm excited about what comes next on the show. And I hope you are too. Before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content, as of this recording, for as low as just $1 a month. We have a full series covering stories such as Poland's rise through the 11th century and our current ongoing series covering the legendary Alexius Komnenos, along with so much more. So join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. This is episode 145, entitled The Next Turn of the Wheel. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. We're embarking on a new phase of our journey through the late Middle Ages, a period where history itself seems to quicken, where Europe transforms in ways that no one could have foreseen. Over the next, who knows how many episodes, we'll delve into the years between 1087 and 1148, or thereabouts, covering far too many topics to name them all here. Suffice it to say that we will begin this next phase with the death of William the Conqueror, and end with the culmination of the Second Crusade. This era reshapes everything we thought we knew about medieval Europe. But first, let's just stop and ask a big question. What are the late Middle Ages? It's a term historians love but can't agree on a shared definition to save their lives, let's just be honest. For most of us, it just feels vague, even slippery. In fact, more than 4 years ago, when naming this podcast, I admit, now 144 episodes in, that I've learned that even my title is a bit vague and slippery. Now, I've readily admitted my ignorance of this time period being the very reason why I started a podcast about this time period. Before beginning this podcast, I'd heard of the early Middle Ages, also called the Dark Ages. I'd heard of the Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. I figured that splitting the entirety of the Middle Ages down the middle, I wanted to focus on not the first half, but the second half, what I felt was the late Middle Ages. It wasn't the early, it was the late Middle Ages. Now, I wasn't wrong, but alas, after 4 years of reading, listening, and studying, I've realized I wasn't exactly right. I wasn't exactly accurate. So let this stand as my apology, my correction, and my refocusing of the entire show going forward. Though no absolutist definition exists, it seems, it's good to take a look at the periods that more or less officially make up the Middle Ages as a whole, in order to somewhat accurately pinpoint what and when we're even talking about here. More accurately, this is the generally agreed upon breakdown of the 1,000-year-long history we call the Middle Ages. First, we have the early Middle Ages, also called the Dark Ages, and it was kicked off with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 450s to around the turn of the millennium in 1000. The High Middle Ages was from 1000 to about 1300, And then we have the late Middle Ages, spanning from 1300 to around 14 to 1500, depending on who you ask. Now, what I've learned in these 4 years, most of all, is that historians, they can't keep their stuff together. I'm just going to say it. It seems to be a trend in academia, no matter what field you're in. Incredibly learned and brilliant thinkers. These people, they also suffer, in my estimation, from a crippling case of hubris and believe their way must be the right way. If there are any historians listening, and I've been contacted by a few, so I know you're out there, please know that I genuinely admire the work you all do. I do, really. And I respect the hell out of you and your endeavors. But please, can we get together and finally come to a consensus about some of these things? These days, it seems to me that people are yearning to understand their history more than ever before. And it'd be pretty helpful if the smartest people in the room, that's you, on the subject, were all on the same page. Just saying, just throwing that out there. All right, so PSA out of the way. Let's really break down these periods in order to see the Middle Ages from a 30,000-foot view. This should not only serve as a stepping off point for existing listeners of the show, but also for new listeners as well. So first we have the early Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages. These were roughly 5 centuries marred by the collapse of the most glorious and all-encompassing empire the world had yet seen. It was marked by pagan barbarian invasions into the Christian world, which spurred a strong counter-movement, spreading Christianity even farther across Europe and the Mediterranean, sometimes at the point of a sword. During this time, the world also saw the birth of Islam and its rapid and devastating spread across the Middle East and North Africa, also at the point of a sword. An erosion in centralized authority replaced said glory and order of Western Rome, and Europe seemed to be stunned into silence. Now, that isn't the whole story, though. Many, many bright flickers were seen in the works of the Venerable Bede in England, the crowning of Charlemagne in Germany, the thinking of Boethius, St. Augustine, and Gregory the Great, the flourishing of the Cordoba Caliphate, King Alfred defeating the Vikings and consolidating the various kingdoms that would become the Kingdom of England, the deeds of St. Patrick in Ireland. The list goes on and on. The point is, sure, Dark Ages in some ways, but it should be taken with a hint of caution that it wasn't all, quote-unquote, dark. The medieval warming period also saw an opening of trade routes across the ice block northern passages, causing Scandinavians to, go a-Vikinging. It allowed longer growing seasons, leading to healthier, longer living populations that produced larger families, thus kicking off migrations across the continent, like those pesky Normans in the 11th century, as an example. Now, as for the High Middle Ages, the period that this show pretty much has lived in so far, this lasted roughly between the year 1000 and 1300. This saw a continuation of the medieval warming period, which continued to allow for even larger populations and increased trade. The intermingling of more and more peoples naturally created friction and conflict during this time, like those of the Scandinavians in the riverlands that became Rus territory, and later Russia. Full-on conquests were witnessed by the Normans in England, the Normans in Italy and Sicily, Christian Iberia, and the Seljuk Turks in the Middle East, while established regimes such as Germany, the Papal States, the Fatimid Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the mighty Eastern Roman Empire, well, they all saw marked shifts in their regional dominance. Feudalism as an economic system and political hierarchy grew and thrived during the High Middle Ages. This was the era of tremendous, and I mean tremendous, castle building. It was the era of troubadours singing about love and chivalry, proud knights in full armor riding into both battle and jousting tournaments with the same gusto, and fair ladies being courted in a way that would set the stage for our modern sense of romance and marriage. The High Middle Ages. These were the days of crusades, the development of universities, a flourishing of art and architecture, and of Robin Hood. The ebb and flow of history was active and real and evident during these 3 centuries. It seemed as the High Middle Ages wore on, the pace of history quickened until the 1300s, when something rapid and jarring brought Europe to an abrupt standstill, something that would fundamentally change world history forever. That event kicked off what are called the Late Middle Ages, part of the title of this show, which again began around the early to mid 1300s, when a massive plague swept the European continent. This was, of course, the Black Death, which was actually a series of plagues that swept Europe as the medieval warming period drew to a long, drawn-out close, resulting in not only the death of a staggering 1/3 of the European population, but also the fundamental change in governing structures, religious organization, and agricultural output. There was no preparing for it whatsoever. Europe was thrust onto its heels, and reacting was all it could do. In the sudden absence of millions, and I mean sudden, it seemed, the system simply couldn't maintain itself. Feudalism waned, peasants revolted far and wide, Wat Tyler's Peasants' Rebellion in England comes to mind, and the 100 Years' War kicked off. If there were ever a true Dark Ages in the Middle Ages, I don't know, the 1300s might serve as a better time to be called it than the early Middle Ages were. But that's just a hot take, nothing more. But these dark times would give way to one of the most energetic, prosperous, and culturally expansive periods in human history, the Renaissance. So, with this 30,000-foot view of the Middle Ages, let's recenter ourselves. Going forward, we will be forthright with the term High Middle Ages as the term between what I focused on as beginning in 991 with the Battle of Maldon and ending with the beginning of the Black Death. From there, we will officially call the beginning of the Black Death to the mid-1400s as the Late Middle Ages. So where does that leave the title of this podcast? Well, let's hold off on that one just for a few minutes, and let's discuss where we've been and what we've seen so far on the show. So far, we've covered a myriad range of storylines throughout the 11th century, beginning again in 991 on the marshy shoreline 1 mile outside of Maldon, England. This event, what became known as the Battle of Maldon, and featured the first of many small deaths of the old regime of Anglo-Saxon England, and the first flickers of Europe beginning to connect, the dots of its post-Roman world. Well, this single event in 991 along the shores of the North Sea has carried us on the sails of Vikings as far as Constantinople, Jerusalem, Kiev, Iberia, and even Newfoundland. We've traveled the unmarked paths from village to village, city to city, battlefield to battlefield, across Normandy, Cordoba, Dublin, and Novgorod. We've seen the decline or outright collapse of grand and complex civilizations, such as the Cordoba Caliphate, Anglo-Saxon England, and Lombard-controlled southern Italy. Towering figures, and I mean towering figures, such as William the Conqueror and his wife Matilda of Flanders, Pope Gregory VII, Queen Emma of Normandy, Robert Guiscard, Emperor Basil the Bulgar Slayer, Canute the Great, Empress Eudokia of Eastern Rome, Earl Godwin and his son King Harold II Godwinson, and Rodrigo Diaz, better known to history as the Spanish national hero today, El Cid, and also Harold Hardrada. They've all lived and died during our first 140 episodes, each one having innumerable stories to tell. I can only hope I've given them even a fraction of the due they deserve. Thus far on the show, Spain, it isn't even a thing yet, but its Reconquista to take Iberia once and for all in the name of Christianity, it's officially begun already. England under Norman rule is firmly established and will never, ever look back, except in bouts of crippling cultural nostalgia. The Normans have irrevocably altered the course of Mediterranean history by simultaneously assimilating into Lombard Italian culture in southern Italy, and begun the construction of one of the most cosmopolitan, progressive, and inclusive civilizations in human history on that little tiny pivotal island of Sicily. The papacy, through the decades-long reform efforts of a man named Hildebrand, or as we know him more, Pope Gregory VII, has unapologetically shifted the balance of power between church and state. And speaking of the church, an emissary of Pope Leo IX earlier, in one moment shattered the tenuous connection between the Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East, lasting to this very day. Settlements such as Cardiff in Wales, Leeds and Newcastle in England, Krakow and Środoslaska in Poland, Oslo and Stavanger in Norway, Zagreb in Croatia, Erbil and Al-Basra al-Haditha in Iraq, Marrakesh and Sijilmasa in Morocco. These ancient cities and tiny settlements, they all grew to prominence during the 11th century, and ports such as Palermo and Syracuse, Genoa, Pisa, Venice, Dublin, Rouen, London, Bergen, Bruges, Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, and Tunis, these all expanded their influence and wealth during the 11th century. The French created the Song of Roland, the story of one of Charlemagne's knights, a man named Roland, and his exploits at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. This story shows one man's embodiment of loyalty and honor and proud Christian identity. The English continued their centuries-long chronicle called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, and they finally put to paper for future generations the epic Beowulf during this century. In addition to these 11th century writings, William the Conqueror commissioned the Domesday Book, a cornerstone of national surveys providing a comprehensive record of England's land holdings and economy. The Kievan Rus, in the thread of all three major writings of the English, that is, a blend of legend, annual happenings, and economic survey, well, they created the very first records that would eventually be collected in the year 1113 into what they call the Primary Chronicle. From the correspondences of Pope Gregory VII and Peter Damian to fiery speeches like Sermo Lupi ad Anglos by Bishop Wulfstan in England, the European mind was on the move around the continent. But the Arab mind was already in an environment that nurtured learning and philosophy, and even science. Omar Khayyam meditated on topics of love, mortality, and the nature of the divine in his grand work called the Rubaiyat. The legendary Ibn Sina, or as the West knows him, Avicenna, was prolifically writing in the early part of the 11th century, namely the Book of Healing that explored logic, metaphysics, and ethics, and his The Canon of Medicine that synthesized Greco-Roman medical knowledge with Islamic medical knowledge into one epic medicine encyclopedia. This would eventually make its way to Salerno in the year 1080 and go on to influence European medicine and diet forever after. Though the coming centuries will see an explosion of artwork, we can't sleep on what the 11th century gave us. The Bayeux Tapestry, commissioned, we think, by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half-brother, by the way, was both a magnificent piece of art and a pretty reliable historical document, all things considered. The tapestry itself is 230 feet long and 20 inches wide. Using wool thread carefully dyed in a range of colors, the creators used a variety of stitching techniques to create it, such as the stem stitch and laden couched work. It was Romanesque in style with bold lines juxtaposed with earthy colors, and it tells a story. The story it tells is a sweeping epic that began with King Edward II's death in 1066. It had Harold Godwinson's oath as a king, the Norman preparation for war, the Norman landing at Hastings, the Battle of Hastings itself, and it ends rather abruptly with an arrow sticking out of King Harold's face. This, it could be argued, is the origin story for the Normans' destruction and overthrow of Anglo-Saxon England. This one tapestry stood as a key piece of evidence from just after 1087, the year of William's death, of not only Norman warfare, but of Norman shipbuilding, Norman fashion, Norman social structures, and arguably the most important thing, the legitimizing proof that Harold Godwinson was a usurper king and that William of Normandy was the rightful heir to the crown of England. A massive revolution in architecture would explode onto the scene in the 12th century, but every iota of this architectural revolution was tinkered and toyed with throughout the 11th century. Church portals, cathedral vaulting, cathedral naves. These were just a few of the numerous aspects of churches, monasteries, and cathedrals that would be played with and perfected before their widespread use and mastery in the coming century. The Romanesque style from Normandy rose in prominence as the Normans moved their way across England and across southern Italy. One began to see rounded arches, thick walls, small windows, radiating chapels, ambulatories, and barrel and groin vaults. When it comes to military fortifications, you started seeing more stone keeps in the 11th century, replacing the timber and earthworks with stone. And war, being a twisted art form itself, we see great improvements in catapults and trebuchets, along with other massive siege engines being utilized to overcome the formidable defenses being constructed. Toward the end of the 11th century, the Normans began playing around with their grip on their lances. Don't sleep on that one either. This, along with the stirrup, would through the next century develop into jousting and other tournament events that would help knights practice for warfare when warfare was scarce. European monasteries began crafting illustrated manuscripts, which were their typical manuscripts, but the margins began to pop with intricate designs in the pages' border work. There was some serious artistic skill in some of these monks' works that gave us a glimpse into the creativity of a post-Dark Ages Christian mind, eager to burst forth and find release in a difficult existence of mundanity and routine. As for Islamic artwork, as I said, Muslims were already enjoying a bit of a golden age in the 11th century, and works were becoming grander, such as the Alhambra in Granada, Seljuk pottery and metalwork back in the Middle East, and luxurious textiles, intricate rock crystal carvings, and lusterware ceramics being produced in Fatimid-held Cairo. Agriculture was alive, and it was progressing in the 11th century too. Heavier plows, stronger plow horses, and metal trenching machinery all allowed for better cultivation of crops. Water-powered mills became widespread, and specifically in France and Germany, we see an expansion of stone bridges, and even, if you can believe it, rent-a-horse services between towns and villages, like a medieval U-Haul company, brought the trade of these crops and wool and other products to more distant markets. On this show so far, we've covered all of this, and it's time for us to move forward, like our ancestors did, and not buck the slow march of time. See, everything we've done up to this point has been, as far as I can tell, merely a prelude. All of those people mentioned, all of those battles and events and correspondences and writings, all of those power shifts, the generations living through the 11th century merely redesigned the world for future generations to navigate, much in the same way you and I are doing today for future generations. Today is no end point in history, regardless how passionate you may be about this election or that policy or those wars. On this podcast, I hope to show us the forest for the trees, or at least one section of the forest. In my opinion, the best way to do that is to study our history. We are a continuation of our ancestors in exactly the same way folks in the 11th century were a continuation of their ancestors. And I can't wait to bring you all the stories of the years between 1087 and 1148 on this next chunk of our story. Imagine a world still shaking from the impact of the Norman Kingdom of England, the conquest and creation of one of humankind's most dominant leaders, William the Conqueror. See, in 1087, he was dead, and his death would fracture the empire he himself willed into being. William's entire life's work was now split between two of his three remaining sons. The political experiments of feudalism were about to be tested on a scale no one had fully imagined. This was hardly just England's story, though. Across the continent, leaders were wrestling with questions of power and legitimacy. Rivalries were being leveraged for the gain of others, and alliances were being forged and broken with wanton abandon. As for the Mediterranean Sea region, the waves were whipped up in a frenzy from ships that brought Norman warriors to the Balkans in a failed effort to take the grandest city of them all, Constantinople. Sicily was about to be completely overrun by Normans, and Emperor Alexius Komnenos of Eastern Rome had dodged a speeding bullet train with the death of Robert Guiscard. But the mighty duke's successors were poised to challenge empires and disrupt the status quo. Within a decade of the deaths of Robert Guiscard, Pope Gregory VII, and William the Conqueror, the medieval world would erupt when another pope would transform Christendom from a sleepy, monkish existence, by contrast anyway, to an uncontrollable war machine. Fueled by religious fervor and the promise of salvation, knights, lords, and commoners alike took the cross. They marched across a continent of dangerous wilderness, through sometimes hostile foreign cities, and into a desert full of their deepest, darkest fears. And they did it in the name of God. And just 12 years into our next period of study, they would achieve their goal of liberating Jerusalem itself. It was unthinkable. And yet, they did it. Their marches, their battles, their sieges, their starvation, their suffering, their negotiations, their sinful thievery, through it all, they'd all made it to God's city on earth. And then, what? Folks, this is just the first 12 years of our next chunk of time. So let's pump the brakes a bit. To begin, we will take a look at the various goings-on of Europe and the Middle East prior to the First Crusade. We'll take some time first to sort out the complex and messy succession crisis in England and Normandy between William's sons. And you'll never guess who comes out on top. Well, I mean, if you're English, you do. But other than that, the rest of us probably don't know. Next, we'll head to France to learn about some pretty important people in the First Crusade, such as Hugh of Vermandois, Stephen of Blois Sr., hey, if you know, you know, and Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy. And when it comes to the First Crusade, people like to focus only on the Holy Land, and for good reason, too. But we can't forget that the Reconquista is underway back in Iberia. And after the death of El Cid, it seems that King Alfonso of Leon and Castile is leading the charge into Muslim territories. This, of course, doesn't come without some pushback, though. Now, back up in the North Sea region, brothers Baldwin IV and Eustace III of Boulogne, as well as their brother Godfrey of Bouillon, all sorted their affairs out. So did Robert II of Flanders, Robert II also called Robert the Frisian, and Baldwin of Hainault, Reynold of Toul, and Engelbert of Tournai. Well, these were all becoming household names in the years leading up to the First Crusade. The waves hadn't yet calmed across the Adriatic Sea from the invasion fleets led by Robert Guiscard. And we need to check out what Hungary's doing, because Hungary took a notice, hoping to inch closer to the coastline without causing much of a fuss. Kings Ladislav I and Koloman I of Hungary, over these years, leading up to the First Crusade, well, they'd paved the way for crusaders to cross their territory on their way to Constantinople, but not before dealing with the Croats and the Cumans. We will, of course, return to northern Italy for a spell, as we have to check in on our favorite Tuscan noblewoman, Matilda of Canossa, still holed up in her mountaintop fortress with her legion of philosophers, who will create the basis for holy war in Christianity. However, we also need to check in with the successor to Pope Gregory VII, a man we've mentioned on the podcast far too many times to count already. We also need to take a look at this man's successor, who will be the Pope to actually make the call for crusade across France and Germany. And finally, we will learn about the Holy Land and its context as it was on the eve of crusade. We'll learn of secret cabals, Seljuk might, and two brothers who unknowingly destabilized the whole region. Now, the next step is to, at long last, follow the path of the first Crusaders. There is far too much to that story than what you may have seen on the surface. We should have by this time met all the key players and some extras as well, in the hopes of building not the story of the First Crusade, but the world of the First Crusade. These people, they didn't just appear out of nowhere. By the late 11th century, Christendom is fractured but ambitious. Western Europe, locked in a violent patchwork of petty kingdoms and competing powers, it begins to find a unifying purpose. That purpose came in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, when Pope Urban II called for knights and kings to set aside their feuds and march to reclaim Jerusalem. It was one of the wildest gambles in human history, an unholy mix of piety, greed, and apocalyptic fervor. But against all odds, again, it somehow succeeded. But this is when history shifts once again. What had just happened in the Holy Land wasn't just a religious war, it was a crucible. Europe learned that it had the power to project itself beyond its various borders. Future empires will certainly take note. Trade routes opened in ways that hadn't been seen in Europe since the days of antiquity. Silks, spices, woods, and arguably most importantly, ideas flooded in from the east. Feudal lords, once focused on their immediate neighbors, they were now thinking in global terms, or at least as global as their medieval maps allowed. But what inevitably rides the coattails of such progress and change is new conflict. The Christian-Jewish-Muslim exchange that had always been, tenuous at best, well, after the Crusades, Jews would be cast to the side and Christians and Muslims would engage in a centuries-long campaign against the other, just as two alphas in any arena are bound to do. As we know today, these divides are still deep and the wounds are still open, fresh, and festering. In addition, the papacy inserts itself more forcefully and boldly into political affairs and even does what it can to pour salt into the wounds created by the First Crusade. In addition, the investiture controversy never really ended. It just morphed into a myriad of other issues that drove wedges between church and state across Christendom. Now, after the First Crusade, the sky's the limit. Here's just a short list of topics we'll be discussing. Well, to begin, we'll take a look at the first stabilizing king of England in quite some time. This king was a thinker and a businessman, and he knew how to organize and restructure government. And we will see how he does it and what the effects of efficient government can look like in a post-conquest England. His name? It's Henry. Henry will have just two legitimate children, a son and a daughter. And as Henry's reign dragged on, something tragic happened that would plunge England into absolute chaos upon his death. We will learn of events such as the White Ship Incident and the Anarchy, and how the incredible reign of one of England's best governor kings was forever marred by what came after his death. We will also continue to follow the Crusader states, those areas held by Crusaders after the First Crusade. This will be a time of Islam licking its wounds and biding its time for revenge, a time of epic queens bursting onto the scene, and a time that would usher in a second crusade. This time period would see one of the greatest civilizations of the Middle Ages, or to be honest, more accurately, over the next 1,000 years, emerge under the stewardship of Roger II of Sicily. While the founding of the Knights Templar and other military orders must be addressed as well, so we'll take a look at those. And over in Iberia, the Almohads would replace the dominant Muslims, the Almoravids, as the counterbalance to Christian Reconquista. Thinkers such as Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Abelard would change the game when it comes to approaching Christian doctrine with the flair of a boundaries-pushing philosopher and not merely a traditionalist. And Saint Anselm of Canterbury, the godfather of scholasticism, a priest and philosopher caught in the middle of a tug of war between church and state, Anselm will emerge as one of the most important thinkers in Western tradition, all the way down to today. Communes would emerge across northern Italy. We'll also check in with how Matilda of Canossa would lead the rest of her life, and believe me, she didn't go quietly into that good night. And at some point, we will return to the Crusader states once again in the Holy Land, where they have grown fragile and weak over the previous 4 decades, clinging together for survival against an angry, vengeful, and surging Muslim enemy coalescing on all sides. Honestly, there's so much ahead, I can't even wrap my head all around it. But I'm incredibly excited about all of these stories coming to life, and I hope you are too. Now, what I envisioned for this I was missing an available podcast focusing on the period that would serve as a proving ground of sorts for modern Western civilization. Now, I'm going to take a risk here. I know it's not very fashionable these days to say such things, but I'm rather fond of Western civilization, warts and all. If this loses me listeners, well, let me make this crystal clear. So be it. I'm not concerned with convincing anyone of anything. I'm too old for such things. I only want to share my learning and my gratitude for the civilization that has brought me and you all so much. I'm critical of many aspects of Western history, believe me, and I will continue to call things out that I personally find abhorrent in our shared history, like the episode concerning the war crimes, by today's standards anyway, committed by William the Conqueror. But I also dread, and I use that word specifically, I dread biting too hard the hand that has fed me things like the Magna Carta or the labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral, the scientific method, double entry bookkeeping, vaccination, Isaac Newton, the sonnet, pizza, though that whole mess with the pineapple and ham thing is uniquely un-Western. I'm sorry, I can't accept it. I mean, Western civilization even gave us the sandwich, for goodness sakes. And most importantly, though, in my opinion, it gave us the United States Constitution, which maybe some bias is being spoken here, but it set a standard. It set a standard for the free world. And it serves the whole world in many ways. The High and Late Middle Ages were more than 2 eras in history. The High and Late Middle Ages were movements. More accurately, they were movements forward. Geographically, politically, culturally, the years we have covered already have been a most essential and infinitely entertaining, if you ask me, prelude, as I said earlier. Though I am marking this as a starting point for new listeners, I urge you all to take a listen at some point to the first 144 episodes of the show. I'm quite proud of them. However, if you would like to pick up at the First Crusades and what happens afterwards, then this is your place to be. The years we will cover going forward, beginning in 1087, are nothing less than a hinge of history. Alliances will shift, empires will rise and fall, and fortune's wheel will keep turning. No one can escape this wheel, and no one can control this wheel. Now, before we get out of here, I wasn't going to do this, but I added it at the last second. I want to explain the title. After almost 150 episodes and 4.5 years, I think it's time to explain why I chose Fortune's Wheel as this podcast title. For starters, I've been fascinated by the word and the mythological interpretations of fortune. To me, on its surface, fortune is inescapable. We are all subject to it, and here's the kicker. We have no choice in the matter whatsoever. To me, fortune represents all of those things that Stoicism labels as outside of our circle of control. Yet I'm obsessed with the idea that we all, throughout history, we all try to fight it. We are always grasping and we are always clawing in defiance of fortune. And to what end? Things still happen whether we like them or not. It's an age-old tale, the tale of the person who tries to defy fortune and is ultimately humbled, punished, rewarded, or driven to obsession with disastrous ends because of this defiance. Admittedly, the anxiety I deal with personally is me dealing with the inescapability of fortune. The ancients were well aware of this too. The Roman Ovid described her as, quote unquote, an unstable goddess, and his fellow Romans personified her as blindfolded in impartiality. Americans have used her to represent our justice system, especially with the blindfold. Romans also created Rota Fortunae, or the Wheel of Fortune, representing how easy it was for fortunes to rise and fall. In one moment, you are at the top of the wheel. In another moment, you're at the bottom. The Greeks believed in Tyche, and she was depicted holding both a cornucopia, symbolizing plenty, and a rudder, symbolizing her ability to steer fate in whatever direction she saw fit. The Norse believed in Norns, three female beings, Earth, Verthandi, and Skull, who controlled the threads of fate, symbolizing the inevitability of our fates and fortunes. Slavs believed in Dulya, who was good fortune, and Nedolya, who was misfortune. Both figures follow each and every one of us throughout our lives, one deciding an outcome in one moment, the other deciding an outcome in another moment. Notice that you and I never have a part in that decision.
We off? 30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like wind in your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox disinfecting all-purpose cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes.
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox carefree.
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet.
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
We humans throughout the ages have even gamified the idea of fortune by the creation of dice. In one Norse myth, the gods and goddesses divvied up territories by rolling dice. Fortune is even a test in some cultures. We'll see this so much more in the witch trials in future centuries across Europe and a young America. Literary characters embody fortune in the archetype of the trickster. Loki, Hermes, and Coyote are great examples. They disrupt expectations in human affairs for no more reason but to see what will happen. More recently, much of the DC Comics character of the Joker embodies this dangerously whimsical flair of fortune. In Christian thought, the philosopher Boethius wrote of a scene in which the goddess Philosophy scolded the goddess Fortuna, calling her fickle and unpredictable, while still acknowledging Fortuna's absolute power in shaping human affairs. In medieval Christianity, fortune was often demonized as a distraction from divine providence, while in Dante's Divine Comedy, he places Fortuna among the angels, tasked with distributing worldly goods according to God's plans, showing an evolution in Christian thinking concerning the ideas of luck and chance. Later even, Machiavelli would write of fortune as a stream or a river that can be diverted by human will and preparation, showing the full swing of the idea in the other direction. We even have sayings in our common parlance, fortune favors the bold, reflecting an ancient belief that luck often accompanies risk-taking. Fortune is a part of our lives today as it was their lives then, whenever then was. This lack of control is always haunting us. We're not so different than our ancestors, you and I. At one time, they were on top of Rota Fortunae. Today, we are. And within both of our lives, we occupied both the top and the bottom of the wheel as well. And speaking of the wheel, circles have been infinitely important symbols throughout history. For starters, it stands for infinity. Apply the circle in the form of a spinning wheel to fortune, and you have the idea that fortune is always working for and against us, but it's always working. It's inescapable. St. Augustine himself wrote that God is, quote unquote, eternal and immutable, much like the circle or the wheel. The wheel also symbolizes unity and perfection as well. No matter what is on the wheel or in that circle, it still represents perfection. So I humbly ask, warts and all, is our history playing out exactly as it should? To perfection, as it were? Beyond this, halos are circles above an angel's head. Circular designs like the one in Chartres Cathedral mentioned earlier, they emphasize harmony and divine order. Boethius, in the same work referenced already, also states that Fortuna and her wheel operate within God's divine plan, reminding believers to place their trust in God rather than worldly success. Everything in our lives today seems to revolve around circular structures. Heck, I just use the word revolve because that's what happens in our lives. Whether we're Christian or not, this is the case. Full disclosure, it may seem that I proselytize on this podcast at times, but I'm personally struggling with faith. But I'm not so naive as to think that my own calendar, for instance, isn't directly linked to the life of this man named Jesus 2,000 years ago. Circles represent sacred rhythm, a methodical recurrence of traditions grounding us to our roots and core cultural and religious beliefs. Heck, I'm recording this one day before Thanksgiving Day here in the States, for instance. Have you ever asked yourself why Christians place wreaths on their doors and windows around Christmas time? Or why the consecrated bread in church is round? Profound thinkers who shaped our thinking even today, such as Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich, both repeatedly mention circles in their writings as the keys to all creation, to understanding it the best a human can. Why is there a circle on the Celtic cross? Pope Benedict XVI, back in 2007, stated the following, quote, "God's eternity does not flee time, nor does it chase after it. It is a circle encompassing all ages." End quote. I don't know. Choosing Fortune's Wheel as a title for my podcast was more of a reminder to me that, again, we're more connected to our pasts than modern technology and modern culture and our politics want us to think. So there you have it. This is the thinking behind my use of Fortune's Wheel as the title of this podcast. What's more is that I have 100% confidence that as we continue this show, you will undoubtedly see innumerable times when our human story repeats itself. These are the points at which we need to draw valuable parallels to not only things we've already learned, but also to things we're seeing today. I firmly believe that by studying the past, we are, in a way, able to see our future with much more clarity. What's happening today, folks, is not new. It has happened many times before in many different iterations. We are not at some end of history, and as many people are panicking about this, we need to relax. We need to return to our story. We're merely a continuum that will repeat itself forever and ever. Now let's wrap this up, shall we? Considering all that's been said on this episode, and it has been a lot, I'd like to unveil the new name of this podcast. I'm keeping Fortune's Wheel for the reasons just stated, but instead of a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, I'm merely broadening it out and encompassing the story aspect of our history. It's a subtle change. I'm not trying to make a huge deal of it. I just want to explain it. And it's been needling me for a couple years now, to be honest. The new title of the podcast is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of our medieval story. I'm also tinkering with sound effects and different music and various ways to break scenes and all of that. I hope to unveil these over the next several episodes, and I would love to get your feedback on each and every one. Also, let me remind you of our growing community on Patreon. For as low as just $1 a month, you can unlock whole new chapters of our medieval story. And with this, thank you so much for your continued support. For the new listeners, we're embarking on new things, and I pray that you join us. But I urge you all to take some time to go back, all the new listeners, go back and enjoy some of those stories as well, the prelude episodes, as I'm calling them. And for those longtime listeners, I can't wait to turn the wheel on this next bit of our medieval story with you. Thank you for listening. Until next time.